And welcome to Austen Mondays. I think I just had a tech glitch for the opening of the show and the credits. I am your host, Edward G. Pettit from the Rosenbach Museum and Library in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. For 24 weeks, we will be bringing you Austen scholars, creators, and Janeites of all kinds for conversations about Jane Austen and her works. Every episode will also end with an hour-long discussion of a few chapters of Pride and Prejudice. I will have a rotating set of co-hosts who will illuminate, elucidate, explicate these chapters along with me. In today's episode, we have Devoney Looser with us. Welcome, Devoney.
So great to be here. Love this.
I am so happy to have you with us tonight. More with Devoney in a moment because she will be with us for not only our opening A Turnabout the Room segment, but she will stay and co-host with me for our chapter annotations on this episode. Next week, we will begin our usual rotating co-hosts of Dr. Lauren Nixon, Dr. Kathleen Hudson, and new to the Rosenbach shows, Casey McMillan. And I would like to kick off this show and this series first with a very big thank you to Lisa Washington. Lisa has generously supported Austen Mondays. Lisa Washington has been a great supporter of our programs and courses at the Rosenbach, and I am so grateful for that. It is financial support for shows like this that enable us to bring you these programs for free. And I will have more info later about how you can support the Rosenbach. So welcome to all of our Janeites and JASNA members around the world. I know we have a bunch of Jane Austen Society of North America members and other Jane Austen people in other parts of the world, and also our loyal audience from the past shows that we've done, Sundays with Dracula, Frankenstein, and Jane Eyre. I am just as excited for this show on Pride and Prejudice as I was for our Sunday shows. And we have a new format with all of you watching on YouTube this time. So, and if you're watching live right now, you can also watch these recordings after the show, or if you have to miss part of it, you can go away, you can come back and watch the rest of it. I invite you to enjoy yourselves talking to each other in the chat. There's a live chat feature that'll get saved, and that'll always be part of all the episodes, something we couldn't do when we used to be on Zoom. You can also post questions there for me, for myself, or for our guests, and I'll do my best to get to some of them during the show. If I don't, I will post answers on our Austen Mondays Facebook group, or you can always drop me a line at epettit, E-P-E-T-T-I-T, at rosenbach.org. Let's go on with the show. This is our first segment, and these segments are called A Turnabout the Room, which I thought was a little bit clever of me. Every week, I'll have Austen scholars, creators, and Janeites of all kinds. In this segment, we'll talk about Jane Austen's bio. We'll talk about Pride and Prejudice. We'll talk about the Regency era fashion, fandom. Maybe fashion will come up. Fandom. It'll be a potpourri of Austenian fun and entertainment. And our very first Turnabout the Room guest is Devoney Looser, Regents Professor of English at Arizona State University and Guggenheim Fellow. She is the author or editor of 10 books, including the forthcoming Sister Novelists. I got a preview copy. The Trailblazing Porter Sisters, Who Paved the Way for Austen and the Brontes. It's out from Bloomsday on October 25, 2022, next month. And also she's the author of The Making of Jane Austen, one of my favorite Jane Austen books. She also has a series of 24 30-minute lectures on Austen called The Life and Works of Jane Austen, that's available through the Great Courses. I own that too. I'm a total Janeite when it comes to you, Devoney. In addition to being a quirky Janeite book nerd, she has played roller derby under the name Stone Cold Jane Austen, which is always cool to have to say. Everybody includes that in your bio, don't they, Devoney?
People like that detail. I'm a much better critic than a roller derby player. I hope. I know that's true. But people like that roller derby part. I think that's really cool. That speaks to Jane's wide appeal, right?
Yes, absolutely does. So Tell us, well, first, everyone, there could be spoilers in this segment. I know in the past we've had people who are just reading books for the first time, even though it's a classic and it's centuries old. Some people come into it fresh, and I can never keep spoilers out of talking about it. I just thought we needed that for the chapter segments. When we annotate the chapters, no spoilers. But in the turnabout the room, it could happen. We could mention something. I don't think it's going to happen today, actually, but just so you know, I can't keep spoilers out of the opening turnabout the room segment, but in the chapter annotations, we definitely will. So, Devoney, tell me a little bit about the work that you do.
I like to think that I have one of the best jobs in the world. I get to talk about and read and write about Jane Austen for a living. Sometimes with students who are really excited to be there, but even if they're not excited, I hope by the end of it, they're glad they did it. So I just feel like I've got a fantastic job that who could have imagined that this would be possible, that you could organize your life almost entirely around one author.
That is, I know that. I mean, I get to do it with several authors. It's great. I read books and talk about them for a living, which is a great thing to get to do. How did you? Well, I don't know if this is I guess there's a professional side and maybe a personal side to this question, but because you've come to do so much work on Austen as a scholar professor. But did you have a moment in your life as a reader or a scholar when you kind of discovered Austen or Pride and Prejudice? Did you have an Austen moment?
Absolutely. I think so many of us did. We talk about these kinds of stories in Jasna an awful lot, but I think this is a common story for people to tell. When did you first get exposed to your favorite book? Mine was, not unpredictably, through my mother. And she knew I was a reader. I was an avid reader, but I was into, I don't know, a lot of science fiction, actually, and a lot of Agatha Christie mysteries, having graduated from Nancy Drew. She took down the copy of Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility that was in our home, and she handed it to me, and she said, I think you're going to like this one. And I started, and I really didn't like it so much. The language was stilted. I put it back, but my mother was kind of insistent. She kept handing it to me, and I would say about the third time, it just finally took, and I saw why it was funny, and I was absolutely hooked. And it wasn't until I finished a PhD, so I was in my late 20s, that I learned that my mother had not actually ever read Pride and Prejudice. She just knew that it was a book that an educated girl should read. And my mother did not have a college education. She had educational aspirations for me and life aspirations for me. And to me, in fact, it sort of became a better story knowing that my mother hadn't read the book. The iconicity of the book, the image of Jane had come down to her well enough to know that this was one that she wanted to put in front of me. And I just think that's kind of cool too.
Yeah. I also had that you said a little bit ago, like that it was discovering that it was funny, that it kind of opened up the world. When I first encountered Austen, no one told me it was supposed to be, well, it was also Mansfield Park. So that was, that's not as funny. There are moments, but overall it's not very funny. But even when the first time I read Pride and Prejudice, I just thought it was the same kind of book. And it was only later doing Northanger Abbey that the professor said, this is funny, this is satire. And it just opened it up. That's odd, I think. The way we approach a book sometimes decides whether or not we're going to get anything out of it, as much as how good the book is.
Yeah, and the cover, the packaging, all these things have an impact on us. And I had decided that this was a book that was boring before I even opened it, which was wrong.
Yeah. Well, since then, let's talk a little bit about especially the making of Jane Austen, because I'm completely fascinated by literary history. It tends to be the kind of way I approach books. Austen is not only kind of big business merchandise and movies and all that kind of stuff now, but she's roundly considered as one of the great writers of English literature. She's canonical, right? She's taught widely. She's also enjoyed by people outside the academic world, which is nice. But Austen wasn't always there. Talk about how the the literary history of Austen, how her reputation developed over 200 years. Like, how did it begin?
I think you can get really egghead on this question and really in the weeds, which I'm going to try not to do. But I would say the
No
history
problem. Weeds, rabbit holes. I love going down them. But God.
But I think the history of Austen's rise to canonicity and iconicity is very much tied up with the changing status of the novel. I mean, the novel in her day was not a high genre. It was sort of ephemeral trash. So I think if we start out by saying, was Austen canonical in her own lifetime? First, she wasn't, but first of all, she wasn't. Secondly, the novel really wasn't.
Yeah, no novelists were then, yeah.
Or a handful of them were seen as great exemplars in the genre. None of them by women, really. Although, I think Austen herself recognized a few of her predecessors who were especially novelists of genius. But to say that she was made canonical without looking at the way the novel was made canonical is a really hard conversation to have. Also, the rise of the women's movement and the women's suffrage movement had a lot to do with the way that she first came to wider acclaim. And so I think these things are all really tied together. So to say, at what period did she become a canonical, or why did she become canonical? I think it's really hard to tell the story without all three of those strands. Her greatness, the novel's rise in terms of its reputation, and the way women were seen as capable of genius, at least more widely by the culture.
And her readership, though, really grows, and that's also dependent on marketplace, isn't it? I mean, it's a very limited readership, but so are many novelists then. And then as technology changes more, they can create books a lot cheaper and transport them all over the place a lot easier because transportation changes. But for me, I always think it's that Bentley standard novel series that once they add Austen for when is that, the 1830s, then people, it popularizes her.
1833. Yeah. And I know that you are also going to have Janine Barkis on a later episode to talk through
next week.
Yes. So I know she is going to lead you through a lot of what you just glossed there. So I'll think carefully about what I want to talk about. But one of the things I'm most excited about having made sense of in the Making Jane Austen is the illustrator of those first editions in the Bentley standard novels in the 1830s. His name was Ferdinand Pickering. And if you go on to the book's website, makingofjaneausten.com, you can see some of those illustrations there that he did. And he really took kind of gave it a different stamp and made it look of the moment of the 1830s. And I think a lot of these repackagings that were happening just changed which age of readers, which kinds of readers could imagine Austen as theirs.
The 20th century, it kind of happens again, doesn't it? There's a readership for her. I don't know. I always go back to that Kipling story and then also the World War I soldiers reading Austen, that she goes through this reputation among general readers too, because we're still not in the people studying her or academies having people read her. Among general readers, she over the course of time becomes to represent something that changes over time, doesn't it? What she represents.
I think she still represents so many different things, and people go to these stories for different reasons. The one you were just referencing there would seem a kind of reason of nationalism or patriotism. I think there are people who
I gave a shorthand on that. Do you want to talk a little bit?
Oh boy, I am not your best expert on that. But okay. What I would say is Claudia Johnson's work has beautifully documented the way that Austen was used in men's clubs, men's culture, and especially in wartime, and documented that just exquisitely in Jane Austen, Cults and Cultures.
There are soldiers' letters in World War I writing about, I was reading Jane Austen, and it reminds them of home, and like as if they were living in these, gentrified estates out in the country.
Right.
But it does connect them to her, but I'm also fascinated too that it was not just men; they were soldiers. And we don't think that that's going to happen now, but
Yeah, and the Rudyard Kipling short story that you referenced, the Janeites from 1926, somewhere in there, late 1920s. It was set in among soldiers in the trenches who were reading this book and connecting to the characters in this book as a kind of shorthand. And it's an incredible short story. It's an amazing document of her popularity at this period. But I think for a while in the critical telling of the story of her popularity, we really emphasized that kind of detail, and we emphasized the Winston Churchill loved Jane Austen details. And we didn't pay as much attention to the way that she was being used in the 1890s and forward by the women's suffrage movement and by the New Woman movement and a lot of more popular genres, rewritings for the stage and radio plays, and things that were really attracting a readership in some cases that was not elite, but the stuff that scholars best documented, at least in the late 20th century, was the elite readings and the elite culture. But there's so much popular culture for her that goes back, to the 1820s, actually, right almost, to the beginning, basically, of her posthumous reputation. And I love that I was able to unearth a bit of that in the making of Jane Austen.
That's fascinating because, I think what keeps Austen so, kind of evergreen now are the adaptations that I think certainly there's going to be a readership, especially by now. That readership is going to stay, but it's the movie and TV adaptations that tend to, I think, keep the attention on her for popular culture. And that happened early on, which was something that I hadn't thought about with her when I first picked up your book, that it wasn't just people discovering her reading through something like the Bentley series, but also stage adaptations. And how early did they begin?
So this is a question I've actually revised a little bit since I published the book. There was a standalone piece that was retitled The Voluble Lady, and it was reprinted in Charles Knight's book in the 1840s called Half Hours with the Best Authors. And it started to be used for staged readings. And it was a monologue of Miss Bates from Emma. And it started to be read almost exclusively by men in what were then called dame parts. So I think this is just a really kind of interesting, complicated, but potentially queer history of Austen on the stage dating back to the 1840s. It started out with amateur actors, but by the 1870s, you find professional actors using this as a kind of set bit in their variety shows.
And it was Emma, huh?
Is that they used this? Yeah, Miss Bates from Emma.
And Miss Bates.
So she was the voluble lady. So this actually became really easy for me to track as a researcher because Jane Austen didn't write anything called the voluble lady. So anytime I found Jane Austen's The Voluble Lady, I could be fairly certain that this was somebody who'd ripped it off from Charles Knight's Half Hours with the Best Authors and was putting it on a stage. But crazy, right? But if we don't count that, then the first stage adaptations that were appearing were in the 1890s and early 1900s. And this is when she moves from a pretty vast drawing room and schoolroom performance history to the first professional adaptation, which was from 1901. And I talk about that a lot in the book. It's a favorite of mine, just really moving because the characters who played the leads were also the directors. So a male and a female lead who also then were co-directors of the play. And I just think that is also a cool part of Austen's performance history.
And what was that novel? What did they do?
So the piece was called The Bennets, and it's by a woman named Rosina Filippi. And she had done these amateur drawing room performance scenes, which really amped up a lot of the ways that the novel reinforces and almost celebrates women's domestic refusals, right? So, I think there are a lot of domestic protest speeches that Filippi ends up selecting out to do these short scenes in this book that she published in 1895. But by 1901, she tries to go to a more full-length version of it. The text does not survive. So what we know is from reviews.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
But what we know is that Winifred Mayo, who played the Elizabeth Bennet, ended up becoming an important person in the women's suffrage movement. And she was at one point imprisoned for her suffragette activism. So there are just all these ways that we hadn't noticed that a lot of the actors and the stage is really early connected to pop culture, to political culture, to activism. It's not at all what some early scholars said was a lightweight history. They said, this the plays aren't as good as the novel. That was often, how they were made sense of. And
Oh yeah.
Who could write it as well as Jane Austen? Point taken.
Yeah.
But the stuff going on around this material was just like really moving to me, and I hope will resonate with some readers too as we think about the ways that Austen was played and replayed.
And it's just to that play though starts as just scenes published in a book, and the purpose of that was for people to perform them at home or at schools or in those kinds of places, right?
Yeah, and she mostly selected out female roles. So it was definitely girls' schools and community groups. There were a few men's parts, but she chose the things that were highlighting strong women or highlighting conflict among women for those scenes. And, I love the idea that that is the way that thousands of girls and young women would have first come to Jane Austen's books, by seeing these domestic protest speeches or giving voice to them, watching Elizabeth, and I'm allowed to do spoilers now, right?
Yeah.
Watching Elizabeth, face down Lady Catherine.
Yeah.
This is the scene they would have been imagining as what the novel's about, not others that one might choose, right?
And that I love that connection too with also Austen's own biography, and that how she would, very young in their whole family, she would create scenes, or their family performed, and this is a regular thing for the late 18th through the 19th century, is that families would perform these scenes and read things like this out loud.
Yeah, amateur theatricals. This is where your Mansfield Park comes in handy, right? Because you see that in action. But we know that Austen read her work aloud. We have family members who record that she read her work aloud, and probably as a way to share it, perhaps also as a tool for developing it.
Yeah, they developed one. They had a whole was it like the barn or something on the estate that not the estate they lived, the next to the house they lived in. Her father's a clergyman. They had developed it into a place where they could perform. I think it's at one point. I'm trying to remember bio now. I'm sorry.
Yeah. And in Steventon, where she was raised, and her father was not only a clergyman, but he also took in male pupils to make some extra money. So it was a pretty vibrant intellectual culture, I think, for a girl who had very little formal schooling. Jane and her sister Cassandra had very little formal schooling. And what they did have didn't turn out so great. One time they were sent home with, the school was shut down for illness, and, there were deaths involved. Ultimately, it was a very, upsetting story. Jane and Cassandra survived. But when they weren't away at these girls' schools, they were in this vibrant intellectual environment. Their older brother, James and Henry, were writers and periodical editors, and we know that the family did a lot of writing, not as much publishing as some other literary families of this time, but they did writing and performing, and it was clearly a vibrant environment where obviously the young Jane Austen got some encouragement to write. Yeah,
I mean, besides the time, a couple brief times she's away at school, she's living in a boys' school. I mean, that's what the home was, because they take in boarders, and she's around that all the time. She not only has, I don't know how many brothers, like 5 brothers, 6 brothers, something like that, but she's also got these other young men coming to learn, and that's the environment in the house. She's I think we obviously given free rein to read not only everything, but all the novels that she wants, which is that's unusual for the time, isn't it, to have especially a clergyman's daughter given free rein to just read novels?
I think it must have been. Although, again, we're talking about ideals and realities, right? the ideals for what was supposed to have been done, and then what people were actually doing always has varied. Yeah. So, I mean, starting with that is important. But I think clearly this was a family that did not have the same look down its nose approach to fiction that some did. she read so widely in novels. That's evident in her Juvenilia. And if people who are listening haven't read Austen's Juvenilia, her childhood writings, I really encourage you to do so. Even, if you could only dip in for a couple of pages, one that really gives you the flavor is The Beautiful Cassandra, which I think it's a novel in 12 chapters, isn't that the subtitle? But it is really only 2 or 3 pages long. You like this one too?
Yeah. Oh yeah, like 1-line or 2-line chapters, and it's very funny, and the satire in it is so adult in a sense, and she's young writing it.
Yes. It's a very adult content and love.
But it's also very easy for children to understand too, which I really like about it. It's what I did a because I was the at-home parent for my 2 youngest. Every summer I used to joke, it's like, it's Pettit summer camp, because like I'm home with my kids, right? And
you have to say how many kids you have to say.
I have 5 daughters, so yeah, so it's I live the Bennet family life. So
did I just make you do a spoiler for yourself? Because
no, not at all.
I absolutely love that.
Oh, people from past shows, they all know I have 5 kids. Okay. I talk about that all the time. My Lulu made the credits for the show, my youngest. So, but we had for Sophie and Lulu that I was home for, my wife and I switched, jobs. She then, was working outside, and I was home for the last 2. One summer we did a Jane Austen camp for the summer, and we talked about it. We watched things. We took our Jane Austen action figure every event we went to. We took pictures of her there. But one of the project that they did is they illustrated My Beautiful Cassandra. Like they each did an illustration for every chapter, which is only a line or 2. And I should share them at some point, because it was a great introduction for children, if anybody's ever looking at that, to do it that way. But it's beyond that. Like, I love reading that little piece and the rest of the Juvenilia. So
yeah, I mean, it's clear she knows all the conventions of novels, like inside and out, because she's able to do send-ups of them in 2 lines that just are eviscerating, that turn the viewer's gaze away from the male hero, right? She walks right by the man who should have been the male hero. It makes it about women's relationships, which are conflict ridden in Beautiful Cassandra. Anyway, it's quite stunning how well she must have known novel conventions at such an early age. And I should say, part of me always wonders, what if she'd published any of her Juvenilia? What if she'd published Pride and Prejudice when it was still called First Impressions in the 1790s? Like, how might this have changed her life? And this is where you brought up earlier that I've just finished this book, Sister Novelists. Those 2 sisters that I've written about there did the same kinds of things in their teens as Jane and Cassandra did, collaborating on texts, writing these very amazing things for teenagers. But the Porter sisters, as they were called, published theirs. And so I think it's a kind of alternate vision of what might have happened if Austen's career had taken a different path.
Interesting. Yeah. I think the only Scottish Chiefs I'm very familiar with. I read that a long time, because I think there's an NC Wyeth illustrated version of it. I think. I could be wrong, but
yes, no, you're absolutely right.
There is, yeah. So and I'm pretty sure that's how I'd seen it when I was young. But and that's Jane Porter, right? And the sister is
Anna Maria. She went by Mariah.
Okay, and Anna Maria, and this is the new book, everyone. The sisters.
Yeah, thanks.
Sister novelists. I'm always happy to plug.
But I think the resonances among Austen and these other figures of her time, we just haven't explored them enough. And I think I love rereading the novels, and I will always be up for reading reading a new Austen book or Austen biography, probably for the rest of my life. But I also think we learn so much more when we set her in a wider context. And the Porter sisters are this just amazing way to try to make sense of what could have been for Austen, but also the scene in which she was writing. There were a lot of other women writers active. There were teens who were publishing their work as teenage girls. She would have known this.
And a year after Austen dies, Frankenstein for Mary Shelley, 18 years old. And, the other, I often think it's the 2 most famous women novelists are or Jane Austen and Mary Shelley. I mean,
Yeah.
just because those works have such resonance throughout, all media. And the writing, Austen Shelley's a little bit after, but it's so close that they,
Yeah, and what's crazy is there were hundreds of others.
yes.
Hundreds. And I think this is something that the wider public isn't as aware of as it might be.
Right. Well, I want to hit a little bit about what you were talking about too, about how Austen, like why she doesn't start publishing early and how that happens. But we'll do that as we start the chapter annotation, as we get into the kind of genesis of Pride and Prejudice. So we'll end this turnabout the room segment now. And thank you so much for talking with me today. Normally I'd be saying farewell to our turnabout the room guests, but
I'm so glad I get to stay. This is
yes,
great.
you're going to stick around for the chapter annotation. So I'm very excited for that. And everyone, coming up on this turnabout the room in Austen Mondays, we have Janine Barkas next week. Then we'll have Natalie Jenner, author of Jane Austen Society, another novel, Bloomsbury Girls. Jocelyn Harris will be here. Claudia L. Johnson will be here. Deborah Yaffe, Juliet Wells will be here a little later. But man, this is like the best Austen show ever. As I'm putting together these guests, I'm like, wow, we really, this is great. So everyone, you can find the full schedule of our special guests and our chapter co-hosts at the Rosenbach's website. You can also join us on the Facebook group. We have a page called Austen Mondays. We got lots more info and links and conversation and fun we have going on there. And I just want to give a quick thank you to Paul Savage. Paul Savage is a friend of mine. He's a board member for the Eastern PA region of the Jane Austen Society of North America, or JASNA. Paul was instrumental in helping me connect with several scholars who will be appearing in later shows. So I think Paul's probably watching tonight. Thank you so much for that, Paul. But first, we have a little segment that I'm going to do and share something. And that would be, boy, I tell you, working with my glasses and as there we go. This will be the Drinking with Jane and Ed segment, as I did for earlier episodes of when we used to do Sunday shows, and we did a Sundays with Dracula. I had a cocktail I designed every week, and then we continued that with Frankenstein. We got a little away from Jane Eyre, but now we're back to it with Austen, and I came up with a cocktail for this episode that I am calling Mrs. Bennet's Truth. And it is gin, elderflower liqueur, and a little Campari, and I garnish it with a orange peel, and it is absolutely delicious. It is, and I try to match it up like this is a kind of Mrs. Bennet in a glass, if that's even possible, right? But I thought it was I wanted to come up with a sweet drink, but a little kind of touch of bitter. She's a bit harsh sometimes, and which I kind of like about her. Mrs. Bennet fares so much better for me in readings as I go on and get older. And I can't wait to really get into the kind of talking about Mrs. Bennet, not only today, but throughout this show. But this is called Mrs. Bennet's Truth. I think it's sweet with a touch of bitter, so you don't get too comfortable. That's important. If you want to have a mocktail version of this, it's got this beautiful color too. The Campari gives it this kind of pinkish orange. It's really nice. You're having one too, aren't you? Did you?
I am. Mine's not going to look quite so pretty as yours.
Oh, but you have this lovely tumbler, this Pride and Prejudice tumbler, right?
I do. Look at that. This is from my friend Danielle Spratt, who wrote a great book with her co-author Bridget Draxler, Engaging in the Age of Austen, and she sent me this book, this glass with the book on it. But you think I already had half of this. Cheers.
All righty, enjoy. Oh boy, it came out really well.
It's wonderful.
If anyone wants a mocktail version of this, I suggest, I think, just do some seltzer and cranberry juice. And if you put a squeeze of lemon in it, you'll still get the sweet, the bitter kind of, not necessarily bitter, but the sweet sour kind of thing going on. Or whatever you want. I mean, anything, if you're drinking tea, then that is lovely. And I'll actually probably have some tea cocktails at some point during this show. So, all righty.
Love the creativity. It's so extra and I love it.
Well, also this right now, I'll take this moment every show to let you know that we bring Austen Mondays to you for free. So if you'd like to support the Rosenbach through donation, you can do so at our website. Your support helps us keep this show free and accessible to everyone. You could also become a member of the Rosenbach. Members of the Rosenbach get free and exclusive access to some programs. I'll tell you about a couple in a moment, plus 10% off of any of our reading courses and 50% off of any Rosenbach programs. Every week, I'll thank those who have either donated or become members. And today, I'd like to thank Elizabeth D. in Riverton, New Jersey, Kevin Q. in Cranford, New Jersey. Kevin, I love you. Thank you so much. I know Kevin. Joyce B. from Coiningham, PA, Susan B. from Phoenixville, PA, Beverly T. and Linda P., both from Philadelphia, PA, and Kelly R. from Pelham, Alabama. So thank you all for joining as the show goes on. I'm sure as happened with previous shows that we've done, we'll have people from all over the world who I'll be thanking for donating or becoming members, as these people did. If you live in the Philadelphia area, you can visit the Rosenbach. And we're having an open house this Saturday, September 24th. You can explore the Rosenbach's library, historic house, and galleries. There will be no charge. And if you're a member, it's always free anyway. To maintain safe capacity, we're still having time tickets, and you can get those in a limited amount by visiting the Rosenbach website to register. I'll be on hand Saturday from noon till 3. So if you come by, I'm there. You can meet me. I'd love for you to say hello to me and talk about a little Austen. That would be great to meet people. We're also having 2 Austen-related programs for our members coming up. On Sunday, September 25, we're having a Young Friends of the Rosenbach event called Ballrooms and Beer Halls. The Young Friends of the Rosenbach cordially invite you to don your best Austen-esque attire and join us for an afternoon of Regency-era politics, drinks, and fashion. You can sip on a fanciful cocktail enjoyed by the upper echelons of British society or enjoy a brew from the common beer halls before taking a look at the political cartoons by George Cruikshank. We have a massive Cruikshank collection at the Rosenbach. 19th century cartoonist and illustrator, most known nowadays for his work with Charles Dickens. He illustrated Oliver Twist and some sketches and things like that. That's that's a Young Friends of the Rosenbach event. So it's not for old bearded guys like me. So if you're watching the show thinking like, I don't want to go hang out with the old guys, this is a Young Friends event. And that's who we're hoping to have come out for this. And then on Wednesday, October 5th, we have another members only program. This for members only. It's called Dress Smart and Behave Civil, Regency Costume in Jane Austen's England. This is an in-person event at the Rosenbach. And if you're fascinated with the fashion of the Regency era, from empire waist to silky satin and structured tailcoats, and have ever wondered about the process behind making these gorgeous clothes? Well, if you want to learn some tips and tricks to making your own ensembles, you can join seamstress Caitlin Gregory, who will spill the secrets of the atelier and demonstrate easy ways to make costumes at home. Space is limited to this, and advanced registration is strongly recommended. Again, it's an in-person event at the Rosenbach. And if you're not already a member of the Rosenbach, it's a great reason to join, so you can go to this program. So, all righty. On with the show, and our next segment will be coming up now. We'll do the chapter. We'll do the chapter annotations. This will be chapters 1 to 3 today. We're calling this Meet the Bennets and Bingley and Darcy. And welcome to our chapter annotation segment of Austen Mondays. I'm just going to follow my script. This is episode 1, covering those chapters. My co-host is Devoney Looser, Regents Professor of English at Arizona State University and Guggenheim Fellow and author of my favorite one of my favorite. I shouldn't say favorite because I have other authors coming on, so I can't say that. One of my favorite Austen books of all time, The Making of Jane Austen. Devoney, so it begins. Here we are. Before we get to just diving into the chapter, and people who watched other iterations of the show, we did the Sundays. No, I just worked through the chapters slowly and line by line. And when we talk about it all, we're going to try to condense this more into an hour this time. So we'll run a little late today. I know that's going to happen because it's already 40 minutes in. So we'll run a little bit late, but that's okay because we're going to hit everything in these chapters. I won't skip anything really important. And before we get to one of the most famous opening lines in all of literature, let's talk a bit about how Austen came to write Pride and Prejudice. Devoney, she had drafted this novel early on in her life, but it was published in 1813, and she is 30. How old is she? 37. Thank you. She's 37, and but she had drafted it earlier, didn't she?
Yes. So what we know, and a lot of what we know is guessing, but what we know comes from a memo that her sister Cassandra wrote many years later, suggesting that Jane had started a novel called First Impressions, which is the earlier iteration of what became Pride and Prejudice, in October of 1796, and drafted it until August 1797. So that 9-month period, if we believe Cassandra's memo, is when this first impressions took shape. Not too long after that, in November, her father, the Reverend George Austen, tried to sell it and wrote to a publisher, Thomas Cadell, and said, I have this novel that's about the same size as Frances Burney's Evelina. Would you maybe want to look at this? And there's a notation on Cadell's record saying that they just rejected it without even looking at it. So they did not even consider the book that would become Pride and Prejudice. And then there's a lot we don't know. So
do we think that it was an epistolary novel? I know many scholars think that it was probably an epistolary novel written in letters. Why do we think that?
Yeah, it's not based on hard evidence. It's based on conjecture, and it's possible. And I think the number of letters in the novel itself might lead us to wonder that. The fact that the epistolary structure was really commonly used, the fact that it seems like probably Eleanor and Mary Ann that became may have been in an epistolary format, but it's a guess. You'll sometimes see people say that it's a fact, but it's a guess.
I think more importantly, what it gets to is that people think that she was writing a novel more in the 18th century style of novels. That's the format that she probably would have been attracted to. But it's also a commentary on her first draft was probably much more like a Richardson novel, a Samuel Richardson novel, or a Fielding. Well, probably not a Fielding. I mean, we know she liked Fielding and read him, but she's more in the Richardson camp.
Or at least that's what Henry Austen would have us think by the time he writes that biographical notice. But there's still references to first impressions in her letters in 1799. And then we get another set of references in 1809. So we don't know a whole lot about what happened to it during that decade. But we do know that by the time she's living in Chawton, working on her mature, what we would call her mature phase, like mature novels, this is one that she revisited in some way. And we know that she lopped and cropped it, is what she said. So she made some cuts, whether those were extensive cuts or more minimal cuts, we don't know. But lots of guesses, lots of people wanting to believe it came from a certain distance to a certain distance. Certainly it must have changed. I mean, over 10 years of a writer's life, my guess is it must have changed, but we don't really know.
And that's unusual too, because I frequently find that when you read a 19th century novel or even an 18th century novel, that what you almost always read is a first draft. And because that's the publishing world, and that's the way it works. And people write their book and they take it, if it gets published or not. And it happens later with Austen, I think, with Mansfield and Emma and Persuasion. They are literally, she wrote it, she revised a bit, a couple chapters here and there, but it's not like what goes on today, like a complete revision. You write a draft, you revise it, you go back. That happens multiple times. But that is what happened to her for Sense and Pride. Probably. That she had reworked these novels later and then finally was able to find a way that they were able to be published, and it's Sense and Sensibility first that she has accepted.
Right.
Do we think that
it obviously worked?
do we think that the Sense and Sensibility becomes the title of the first novel, and it sells well enough. There's even a second edition. That is that why you think she goes with Pride and Prejudice as a second title? I wonder if even she came up with it. I mean, because it sounds like a real marketing thing to do after Sense and Sensibility to then do Pride and Prejudice.
So I did this edition of Sense and Sensibility for Penguin Books, an anniversary edition a few years ago. So I looked into exactly how many novels used conjunctions like and or. Verses was very uncommon, but there were lots of ands and ors. So I think she was taking a pretty common trope of, one quality plus another quality, and Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, these were kind of sing-songy, alliterative. But what's different about hers is that it wasn't like one good quality and one bad quality, which was a lot of these novels were like, love and hate, right? I mean, that's the kind of way that a lot of them were. They were black and white morality. And I think what's cool about both of hers is that you have these words that are a little bit more gray area words.
Yeah.
Even prejudice, which I think we rightly today understand as a negative association word, had some positive valences at this period. The Oxford English Dictionary includes an example of the word being used as a prejudice on the side of education. So, you're prejudiced towards something positive. And so I think these are complicated and interesting words that she chooses. So even if she chooses this common form, she does it in this more morally open, gray area, fascinating way. But the phrase Pride and Prejudice was used all over the place before she used it. She's not the one who came up with that.
Yeah, that's a common phrase.
At least somewhat. But the most important usage of it is Frances Burney's novel from 1782, Cecilia, where there's a line toward the end of the novel which uses the none of this would have happened if it weren't for the let's see, I even wrote it down somewhere here because I knew I was going to want to quote it. The whole of this unfortunate business has been the result of pride and prejudice, is what Burney wrote. And then it wrote it three more times. There are three total times in the page in caps, small caps, Pride and Prejudice. Same paragraph. So the assumption is that Austen certainly read Cecilia and likely hung on to that phrase from that novel. But it's possible that she could have drawn it from any number of places, including Samuel Johnson's writings. Just it was around. It was around.
Well, we know that she certainly read Frances Burney because she also subscribes to one of her, is it Carmilla, right?
Yeah, Camilla from 1796. And it's believed, I was just in the ASU Special Collections room with my graduate students looking at, ASU happens to own a copy of Burney's Camilla, and looking at the subscriber list, which was a place where people who kind of crowdfunded a novel got their name printed for having given money to like a Kickstarter for the novel.
Yeah, that's what had sometimes novels are published that way. It's just like a Kickstarter. Yeah.
So in under the A's, you say J. Austen Steventon, and it's believed that this is the first time Jane Austen's
Miss Jane Austen's.
Thank you. Yeah.
And it's spelled ASAUST IN, isn't it? Is it misspelled? I can't remember.
I do think it's Ian, but now
I
just looked at this, so you'd think I could tell you definitively.
Yeah. But we have that at the Rosenbach as well. We have that copy of Camilla with Miss Austen in the patrons in the beginning. So
yeah, so first place her name appears in print in a subscriber list of
and so we know that she was very much interested in Burney, so much so that she was even willing to give whatever little money she would have had to get her own copy of this book.
Exactly.
To the 18th century version of Kickstarter. So, or was it 19th by then? I can't remember what year that's published.
Late 1796.
Yeah. All righty. Great. So she has Sense and Sensibility published, second edition. She's doing well. She can do another novel, and she seems to be, she at least has this first impressions that she's able to work. She doesn't have to just write a whole new novel for her second novel. And she publishes it. And it begins, boy, most famously. Do you have the text with you, or?
I do. I'm gonna be looking down at it. That's okay.
Read those first two paragraphs.
Ooh.
Very short, obviously.
Yes. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. However little known the feelings or views of such a man may be on his first entering a neighborhood, this truth is so well fixed in the minds of the surrounding families that he is considered as the rightful property of someone or other of their daughters. Never gets old.
It doesn't. And so much to unpack in that.
Yeah.
Truth universally acknowledged. Let's start there. And this is the kind of sentence that people who expect this novel to be kind of so serious and tendentious look at that and think, oh, this is exactly what it is. And it's not, but but it also takes on that because she uses that phrase, which is not an unknown phrase again in the 18th century or in like
thousands of uses, thousands of rough uses of that.
That this is the kind of phrase that people use to make statements that or they're being very serious, that this is, a truth universally acknowledged, that they're absolutely trying to say that it is something that is universally known. And this is a little different, right? This is, I mean, we have to put the irony hat on for this. And just with the first part, that, and just so people know too, that the single man in possession of a good fortune, so a rich young man, must be in want of a wife. And just so everybody remembers too, that because want has changed, we don't usually have this definition of want, but this definition of want is also changing at the time. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so the more likely reading of this in want of would be lacks.
Yes.
Like you wish you had one or must
needs.
Need
one. Yes.
Yeah.
So yeah.
But there are scholars who gloss this line and say that it does have this edge of desire there too. So it's slippery, but I think the way it should be read, if you're reading it on the surface, is as must needs, desires is to the side, but lacks, wants.
And so it's, well, he must need a wife because he's got the bucks and he's still single. So what else does he need? He needs a wife now. This is, this is just, of course, everyone knows this is what the narrator is saying. And I want to talk about what this narrator does in a little bit too. And then things change a little bit though, then that's or we get some more in that second paragraph.
Well, I'm going to pick on one thing that I love first, Ted, if you let me not move us forward. But the fortune gets an adjective. It's a good fortune, and the wife doesn't, which I also just find endlessly funny. I mean, I could spend hours talking about this line with students and have, maybe till their eyeballs bled. But I think there's just so much you can do with the ways that money and people are laid out here, and the way that gender comes in both of these first paragraphs. It's just fantastic.
Well, at the end of the second paragraph, then we get in the rightful property.
Yeah.
That the man is held as the win. So how does the second paragraph start to change this? I've watched your video on Great Course, so I know that you have opinions on this. So that's why I'm asking.
Yeah, I might have a shtick on this, but I don't have a script in front of me now, right? It's harder. But I think the second paragraph really overturns the first, right?
Yeah.
If you read this first one, and the scholar Isabel Grundy has called it a spoof aphorism, which is a 2-word description of what this is. I think that's a beautiful, beautiful way of putting it. The first one looks like it's just a straightforward aphorism about universality. But by the time we get to the second one, now we're in a neighborhood. We're not universal anymore. And we now get a sense of who's speaking because we've got the reference to daughters. So this is a kind of parent's truth that we're getting by the second paragraph. And again, I could spend way too long on this, but you're going to tell me how long to spend or not to spend.
No, go for it. Like for me, it's that the young man is now just as much the property, at least by the neighborhood and the families now, as the wife was, in the beginning. So because and wife is, I mean, legally, wife is a property of her husband at this time too. And now also playing with that and saying, well, you're just as much property too, right? Though. And they're going to gain property. through land by marrying someone like that. So.
Right. So you've got man and wife, and you know, she's defined by marriage. So she's the object, she's the property. But then the second paragraph, as you said, overturned. Now suddenly he's the object, and he's the one being manipulated by the community around him. But you know, I think that the fact that this is a parent's truth, this is a kind of this is an old people's version. I think if you read carefully, this is an old people's version of what should or could happen.
So I'm going to read it much differently. And I've told people this story before, that when I used to read Austen, when I was young when I discovered Austen. So I just fell in love with every heroine that she had, even Fanny Price. You know, that was the way I kind of viewed the novel. Well, now I have 5 daughters, and they're almost all grown too. So like when I read now, I see them as I view them through that different lens, and I view them as young women who personally would be kind of more in the daughter camp instead of the romantic, you know, interest camp. But that kind of perspective we have in approaching a novel too is like we're always like it's always new every time we read it, because we're always a different person, right? And for me that really changes for this, and there's no way I would have picked up on those kinds of things as a young man reading that I pick up on now, that parent's view that you said.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's so much is packed in to these lines, so much that it's a stunning, I think, moment of charting her genius. You could spend you know, ages.
We could have a show on the first 2 paragraphs. I'm sure we could.
Yeah.
You know,
I love the truth, the way truth gets used, and you named your drink Truth, so I know you're onto this.
Well, it's Mrs. Bennet's Truth. So, and that will, like, you know, and when we finish this 24 weeks from now, we'll go back to this and say, like, well, you know, what did Mrs. Bennet say in the beginning? Well, because it's her thought process, but it's also the narrator, and I'll hit that in a little bit too. But then what she says, and what the whole point of this is that Netherfield Park is let at last.
Yes.
And then we have this first short chapter is almost all dialogue now, which is really fun to read. And it's one of the things that I think makes Austen, you know, so readable now, is how well she does dialogue. But it's Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Bennet. And I bring this up only because everyone is so aware of adaptations. And in adaptations, Mr. and Mrs. Bennet are all older than even me with my long gray beard now, usually. They're like in their 60s or something. And, you know, like they're always so much older. And one of the things I like to point out to people first time reading this is that, well, he'll say at the end of one of the chapters here, they've been married for 23 years. And they were, you know, relatively young when they got married. I mean, they're in, Mrs. Bennet is certainly only in her early 40s, as Mr. Bennet's probably not much older than 45 himself, because of what he talks about, how he was young and when he met her. They're parents, and they're clearly in the, you know, that elder category, but they're not elderly people as they're usually portrayed, as we usually see.
Absolutely not, unless you're, you know, to switch over to Marianne Dashwood's perspective and Sense and Sensibility.
To young people, they're old, and that's why I like that too. Is that but if you're 20, you're gonna be like, oh my god, you're like 40 something. That's so old, and that we also have that perspective, and there's all kinds of ways that I think the narrator plays with this with us that I'll talk about as we go along. But besides their age and who they are and what they would look like and all that, it's this bantering that goes back and forth between them. You know, you want to tell me, which really establishes the tone of Mr. Bennet through this, you know, and then the narrator comes in, this was invitation enough. The way they talk to each other, that Austen, right away is establishing this kind of playfully ironic, almost wry, but not quite wry tone. And if we weren't aware that that opening was supposed to be slightly mocking or ironic, we should get that fairly quickly. And not only in the way they talk to each other, but when the narrator comes into that this was invitation enough, is this understated, almost snarky way of describing how they talk to each other.
It is. It's incredible banter. And I see that there's in our Q&A, Mimi's asking,
yes,
if presenting it through dialogue is meant to be make it kind of a performative text. And I think absolutely, this is something that you feel like a fly on the wall.
Yeah.
Rather than having a narrator come in and tell you about these characters, you get them, it's the old show us, not tell us, right? We're shown, except for those lines from the narrator that you just pointed out, which allow us to see the way it's a jab.
Yeah. Mrs. B has her info. She's gotten it from Mrs. Long, and it's got a young man, large fortune, and I have the details. Young man, large fortune, north of England. He has a chaise and four, and then his servants are going to be in. So it's like that's all the pertinent information, because it tells you what kind of person that Bingley is. But also that's the way, and we'll see this constantly in this book. That's how information travels in this book, mostly through women. And one of the things I haven't really thought about this when I read this in the past, and I'm really going to examine this time, is that always the case? Do men in this book keep to their own world and don't share information? I know there are times that does happen, but women always share. And so that's one of the things I want to pay attention to in this novel. Do you have any thoughts on that right off the bat?
Well, I think another thing we should be thinking of is that some of the gossip is also probably coming through the servants.
Yeah.
And I think that's often Austen's novels, the servants aren't given voice. But I think that is an implicit moment here where we can see that one set of servants talking to another, male or female, might be some ways that this information is traveling.
How does Mrs. Long find out?
Yeah.
So, it's very much could be from servants. Yeah.
But I take your point that, gossip is a really interesting word, and it's definitely associated more with women.
It is.
Patricia Meyer-Spacks has a book on the subject of gossip in this period that's beautiful. She's also the same person who did that Belknap Press and
the Harvard one. Yeah.
Oh my God, I love that version.
Yeah, it's really good.
At that today, it's just so gorgeous. But this idea that gossip is how they are getting access to this information. This is all absolutely about gossip, and Mr. Bennet seems to be suggesting that he won't participate.
Yes, there's a single man, 5,000 before 5. What a fine thing for our girls. And he's like, oh, how can it affect them? And this kind of, way that he teases her constantly also establishes him, like, at least in his, like, he's in, he thinks he knows he is above her because she doesn't know, I can tease her all the time. She doesn't know as much as me, but what I find fascinating is that she does know a lot of things, but it's just not what he knows.
That's well put. And she also is undeterred. That's
Yes.
clear that they've had this conversation, hundreds of times. And she seems to come back and set him up for these wryly delivered snarky insults, either because she continues not to realize that they're coming or because she doesn't care. And it's hard to say which, right?
Yeah. And they're all, most of them are funny.
They're very funny.
I still find him funny. Even when he's being mean, I still think, but it's still funny. He is very sharp, and that is the description of him a little bit later. But Mrs. Bennet is very concerned here because she kind of knows that he needs to contact Bingley first. And for anyone that doesn't know, this is the like Mrs. Bennet, even though she is a woman in this kind of landed estate gentry class, she can't call on Bingley. She had the husband, the male of the head of the household, has to call on Bingley to set up an introduction. and then the families can connect. So there's a legitimate reason for Mr. Bennet to make that connection, and he doesn't want to admit that, he needs that. He knows it, of course. He's just kind of toying with her the whole time. And it allows her to then start on her nerves. And actually, before then, though, we get very briefly, we do start getting the establishment of the daughters.
Yes.
Mr. Bennet likes Lizzie. I must throw in a good word for my little Lizzie. And then Mrs. Bennet says, no, Jane's so beautiful. And then she has to talk about Lydia.
Good word, Lydia.
Yes. So Lydia seems to be her favorite. As we get through this, but their whole, you have no compassion on my poor nerves, and his very funny line, they are my old friends. I have heard you mention them with consideration these 20 years at least, which is a little mean, but I still find that line funny.
Absolutely. And there's some suspicion that Jane Austen's mother may have been somebody who had issues with nerves, as they were called. So
yeah,
there's a lot here.
Yeah, she mentions that in the letter, or to Cassandra, talking about her mother's nerves. So
there's a lot here that I think is gentle teasing, but also really an expose on people who are wanting to be the center of attention, right? So
right.
This is hard to parse, I think, fully that way. But I also love that Lizzie's described as quickness, and then we later get a description of Mr. Bennet as quick. So they're not only connected by his liking her best, but by this quality that they share.
Yeah, he has this so odd, it's the very end of the chapter, the so odd a mixture, Mr. Bennet was so odd a mixture of quick parts, sarcastic humor, reserve, and caprice. And that's where we see that they've been married for 3 and 20 years. And then Mrs. Bennet, is her mind was less difficult to develop, which meaning to understand or to know what her, and mind meaning her character in general. She was a woman of mean understanding, little information, and uncertain temper. And then the business of her life was to get her daughters married. Its solace was visiting and news being a kind of gossip. But this paragraph lets me know right away that the narrator is giving me this kind of the narrator is almost on his side, that she's belittled. He may be described, so he's not necessarily praised, but he's not condemned. He's kind of odd and funny. But more importantly, he understands what's going on. This seems to be what the narrator tells us in this. And this is like just right here in the first chapter. This is like one of the brilliant things about this novel, about Austen's works in general, is how these third-person narrators convince us of how things are, but they're really not revealing everything, and they're giving us this kind of slanted view. And it's known as free indirect discourse, something that Austen is sometimes created with founding, but if she doesn't come up with this, she is certainly the first great proponent of this kind of form of. Can you give a better description of what free?
No, I mean, that was beautifully said. I mean, I think there are people who would say Burney was using this and others were using it, but Austen is often seen as perfecting it, or at least doing it better than her predecessors in a way that almost seems seamless. I think this is especially in Emma. There are places.
Emma's where it's just a triumphant use.
You get pulled in and out of perspective, and you go from the narrator into the heroine's head, and you're not even entirely sure where it happened. I think here you can feel a little bit more where it's happening, but the idea is that the omniscience is also in the heads of certain characters. And some more than others, right? And we get the sense right off the bat, as you said, that the narrator is here giving us more the perspective of Mr. Bennet than.
And it tricks us because we're used to, like, a third person should be omniscient. Like, we kind of almost expect third person to be omniscient. It's just the objective narrator God here telling you what's going on in this world, which is different than a heavily kind of personalized narrator like Dickens usually is. It's not necessarily Austen talking to us. but it is definitely someone who is not, objective in this. So
Clearly.
always beware of what you read about people. All righty.
I like that. Well put.
But chapter 2 starts right away that Mr. Bennet, of course, he was among the earliest who waited on Mr. Bingley. He was not going to, pass up this opportunity to have this man come and take one of his daughters off his hands, especially if he's rich. That he does understand the importance of it, but he needs to continue teasing his wife and family about it.
It's also just something that a good neighbor would do, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I think there's a kind of bro culture to this too. That this idea that this is how men behave with men. So
Yes.
yes, of course, Mr. Bennet is doing what Mrs. Bennet wants, but he's also doing what the society says should be done. He's going along with the rules that he's just made fun of in the previous chapter.
And throughout this whole scene now that we get in this chapter where he's talking about this, we're, because of that opening there that we understand that he first went in, but they don't know, the daughters and the wife know, we're in on his joke, that the reader is kind of part of that conspiracy. And I love that it's another way that Austen puts us on, or the narrator maybe puts us on Mr. Bennet's side, but it's also a way to bring the reader into the action. Like, we're aware that the joke is being played and they're not. And that gets a reader more involved in the text.
Yeah, and we've just been told that he delights in vexing her. So
Yes.
we know that is what we are about to encounter when he's withholding information here in chapter 2.
And they go through it. So everything they say about it, we know that, like, yeah, he's met him. They're all going to get to, meet him and do this. But Elizabeth just says, well, we'll meet him at the assemblies. I just want to take a quick note on that these assemblies, these are public dances for the community there. These are places where men and women, as well as a kind of a slight mixing of social classes, can go on too. And that as isolated as well, the Bennets are isolated in this community. Like, these are the only people they can get to know, that his girls can get to know, are the people here. But that is the one opportunity that they will have to meet some. It's like, well, my kid, we live in a very small community, small town, Jenkintown, where, like, little high school, like, there's, like, 50 kids in a grade. And that's it. That's your circle who you're going to get to know, unless you can go outside of your circle. And today you can, but in, early 19th century England, you can't. They unless they're even richer than they are, they can't just go to London every season and spend the whole time there. They're isolated, but the assemblies give them an opportunity to break out of that a little bit.
Right. In a private ball, the person who's throwing the ball could control the guest list, but the public assembly isn't like that. There, the control is who's introduced to whom and who's previously been introduced to whom, or who has the ability, based on a previous knowledge, to further introductions. So you're right, more mixing. Yes.
And let's jump to that, because there's a good bit to talk about in that third chapter. Although it's hard for me to jump over Kitty's coughing.
I know, or Mary wishing to say something.
No, we are gonna. There's two that we have to hit.
Okay.
Don't keep coughing so, Kitty, for heaven's sake, her mother says. Have a little compassion on my nerves. You tear them to pieces. And then the great Mr. B line, Kitty has no discretion in her coughs. She times them ill. The way they relate to each other that's not only a funny little moment, but it's a very personal moment, isn't it? It's also, we feel like we're in the midst of a family here, and the way they relate to each other.
Absolutely. And poor Kitty replies fretfully, which tells you already something about her. And
yes,
she gets put in, triangulated in this parental debate or this dispute.
And we'll see how she gets treated later too. Well, Mr. B finally reveals his secret, and he gets to please everybody. But even before that, we have what he says about Mary here, right?
Yes.
What say you, Mary? For you, a young lady of deep reflection, I know, and read great books and make extracts. And then, do you have the next part there?
Oh, you want me to read along?
Oh, no, that's fine. I can do it if you don't.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
Mary wished to say something very sensible, but knew not how. And then he says, while Mary is adjusting her ideas, which is funny, but this is all definitely a little mean about Mary.
Oh, unquestionably. I was going to show just a little prop, which is I got out my copy of, Elegant Extracts, which was an actual book. So Mary is doing something that was common. She was collecting sayings and putting them in a book, but there were actually published books of sayings like this, where you could read these little snippets of wisdom. So Mary likes to collect snippets of wisdom, but she's not sensible. So that does not bode well.
And she wants to be wise, but she's not. And I think throughout, this is important to know too, because throughout this book, we'll see how Mary knows the importance of performing for people, not just the piano, or when she knows the importance of this kind of performative aspect of how you behave in situations and how you come across and the things you need to say. And she fails in that. She fails to do it in ways that please other people.
Right.
And they all let her know that.
She's very interested in right conduct, but she bases on snippets.
Yeah. I mean, we still have, well, I was thinking today, like, we still have quote books. And then I thought, well, we don't have that many. I think you've edited one for Austen.
I did. I make a joke at my own expense in the introduction to that. But yeah, the Daily Jane Austen Year of Quotes from University of Chicago Press. But obviously, anybody who does a quote book of Jane Austen's has to understand that she makes fun of people who select out beauties from other people's texts.
And the internet has kind of taken a lot of that away. So I used to constantly go to quote books I had several quote books, and I would go to them all the time for different things in writing or to use. And now you just look them up. So
yeah, but you should make sure that they're by who they say they are, because an awful lot of quotes marked Jane Austen are nothing of the kind. And I'm sure Deborah Yaffe will talk about that with you when you have her on.
That'll be great. Yeah. Yeah, I can't. Yeah, that's definitely something I'll bring up with her then. Chapter 3. Lydia gets singled out again at the end of this chapter from Mrs. Bennet, so we know she's the favorite. But we have to talk about this. The assembly that happens and the introduction of Bingley and Darcy. First, it was in this chapter that we get this kind of Mr. Bennet won't engage in. They keep asking him for information about Bingley, and this is when again I was saying, like, he won't engage in gossip or just kind of information. He won't pass along information at all. And so they need to go to another woman, in this case, Lady Lucas. And her report, again, it's like we had earlier, that he's young. Bingley is young, he's handsome, he's agreeable, and he's going to be at the next assembly. So they're all happy about that.
Although, can I interrupt, Ed, that there's that section where it's kind of like a game of telephone. And if we're going back to the idea of truth, we get a bunch of things that are rumors that are not true. About how many sisters, how many, this is like, it's garbage information that they're all passing around to each other.
It changed, and it goes from worst to best. It's like, at first he's unsettled because he has to go into town, and that's like, we don't want someone like that living here. And then it's kind of partly good. He's going to come to the ball, but it's not good because it's a large party.
And five sisters.
Yeah.
Which is funny.
And then it's a smaller party. And then it kind of gets, by the time he shows up, it's pretty good. He gets 2 sisters, one's married, and he brings another young man, which is like, that's what we want.
Much better than 5 sisters.
But that young man is Darcy, and who goes in one paragraph from drawing the attention of everyone by his fine, tall person, handsome features, and noble mien, and has 10,000 a year, to the end of the paragraph, not even the end of the paragraph, being proud, above his company and above being pleased, disagreeable countenance, forbidding, and unworthy to be compared with his friend. So in the whole, course of one paragraph, Darcy's the top to the bottom. Even with 10,000, they
That,
still, yeah.
right. He's got twice the money, but he's absolutely eviscerated by the end of that description.
And
these are incredible amounts of wealth. I mean, I think probably most of the people listening understand that well, but 10,000 pounds a year puts him, in the stratosphere, like
it is, yeah,
aristocratic level wealth.
I read everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, I read. Yeah, that's what I always say. I read everywhere, and though it's like, oh, it means he has this much money. It's everything costs differently in the way you live and all. And the best way to describe it is he's a 1%er.
Yeah.
So, Bingley's like almost a 1%er. He's like rich enough that he's fine, but Darcy's the 1%er in this novel.
Absolutely, probably even top half of 1%. He's stratospheric.
And also, this is more this kind of with Darcy going down in reputation in this paragraph. That's more of this free and direct discourse too, right? This kind of, we're not really being told about who he is and what he's about and what he's doing, but his attitude is slighting people, and because he seems proud to the people there, especially Mrs. Bennet, that's what we really see that goes on through the course of this his dance here. So,
and I think people aren't wise to the fact that they've just read that whole section about town rumors and gossip being wrong.
Yeah.
And then they're led through another set of what the neighborhood decides, and that's interesting.
We do, though, get a moment where we see that he's a real jerk, right? Bingley says you should dance, and he's like, no, you're dancing with the only person that anybody could dance with here, which he's probably only saying because his friend is dancing with her, because Bingley's dancing with Jane, and Bingley says, well, first, that she is the most beautiful creature I ever beheld. So we get the beginning of a romance for the two of them. But he's saying, let me introduce you to her sister who's standing there. And you have Darcy's words there, his very famous words. She is tolerable.
Yes, she is tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me. And I am in no humor at present to give consequence to young ladies who are slighted by other men. You had better return to your partner and enjoy her smiles, for you are wasting your time with me.
And Elizabeth overhears it. She's standing right. She's next to them. And Darcy looks over, catches her eye, and then says this. So he knows that she can hear. I read this. That's the way I read the text. That he must know she can hear this, and this is part of him being proud at this moment in the novel too. That he really slights her. It's not necessarily publicly, but enough that she knows he's doing it. And Bingley knows he's doing it, and then I always am wondering what to make of her reaction, because I don't always trust the narrator in Austen, and the Elizabeth remained with no very cordial feelings towards him. I mean, that's litotes. That's this understated way of using a negative, like no very cordial feelings towards him. Is it really more than that? But then it says that she kind of makes a joke about it because she delights in anything ridiculous. And I guess it depends later on her and how she behaves, and what she talks about as to how much this either hurts her or she just finds it ridiculous, as the narrator says.
Right. And I think it's in Pat Speck's notes for that Belknap Press edition, I'm pretty sure, where she makes a comparison to other heroines in similar situations in other novels.
Yeah.
And the other novels, by Burney, by Edgeworth, the heroines are hurt and are shown feeling it, taking it hard. And so I think this is a really unusual moment for a heroine, that she laughs it off. But I totally take your point. Is that laughter coming from a place? Where is that laughter coming from? Where is her move toward comedy coming from? But even the idea that she reaches for comedy makes her an unusual heroine here.
Yes. Well, they come home and they recount the, also there's a little account of everybody here. Mr. Bingley dances with Jane twice. Jane is gratified, though in a quieter way. So we learn that a bit about Jane. Mary heard herself mentioned to Miss Bingley as accomplished. So she's happy. Catherine and Lydia, Kitty and Lydia are just dancing with everyone. Never fortunate enough to be never without partners. And Mrs. B is entirely happy that her daughter Jane danced with Bingley twice.
And the twice is unusual.
Yes.
Is that where you're going with that one next?
Yeah, because they go home and they talk to Mr. Bennet there and let him know this, but the fact that he dances with her twice, as she'll let you know too, because she says, oh, and then the second two and the third two and the fourth two. So what it means is if you ask someone to dance, it's two dances. And a dance for now, when people dance to something, it's as long as a song.
Right.
The dance then was as long as the number of people dancing, because it's a country dance and you're all in a long line. So the more people involved in it, the longer the music will go on. And it could be 20 minutes or so, or even more for just the one. So for two, it's even long, it could be 30 to 40 minutes, and then it double it. So he's with Jane like at least an hour, if not more, as a partner. So that's significant. And that he did ask her to do the second time, and he didn't ask anyone else, apparently, he has signaled to the locals that he's interested in Jane, right?
Absolutely. And, there's some sources that will tell you to dance with the same person twice, you should be engaged. I think that might be a slight overreading, but it's definitely a demonstration of a level of interest that's unusual for a first night.
Mrs. Bennet may easily think that that's as good as being engaged. So,
right. Well put. I love that.
So she's trying to tell Mr. Bennet of all these dances, and he's like, good God, I wish he had broken his ankle. Like, he doesn't want to hear any of this. But I'm also fascinated too, because I probably the first time reading this, I didn't notice Mr. Bennet's not at the ball. So he doesn't go to the assembly. He is willing to have, like, this is fine for my wife and daughters to go out to, but I'm just going to stay home and read my books by myself. He is not a sociable. He's sociable enough to make the introduction, but he's not sociable enough to go get to know his neighbors. Yeah. Today's episode ends, or this chapter ends, is the Mrs. Bennet again recounting the shocking rudeness of Mr. Darcy. Read that final paragraph there.
But I can assure you, she added, that Lizzie does not lose much by not suiting his fancy, for he is a most disagreeable, horrid man, not at all worth pleasing. So high and so conceited that there was no enduring him. He walked here and he walked there, fancying himself so very great, not handsome enough to dance with. I wish you had been there, my dear, to have given him one of your set downs. I quite detest the man.
He's got 10,000 a year. Like, yeah, she does not, that's not, even for Mrs. Bennet, who is I think too often seen as only mercenary. Manners are important. And in this case, at least, maybe it's just because he's slighted, so she feels the confidence that she can go and go back at him. But I also think it goes back to that first sentence, right? Because if that is her point of view, and it seems to be that's her point of view, that a single man of good fortune must need a wife, that Darcy doesn't behave like he's supposed to behave. He is a single man in possession of a good fortune, and he doesn't want one. He doesn't want a wife. And
or no one of there is of consequence enough to tempt him. So that tells us something about his vision of himself, correct vision of himself in the hierarchy of status and wealth, but where he's willing to quote unquote stoop to, right? And
it keys the reader in too, especially now that we might look at the Bennets, living our lives and think, oh my God, they're so rich, and they're well-to-do, they're gentry, they can afford to live well, but they're not in his class. They are not, that kind of, nobility that Darcy is in, nor do they have the wealth. And also their wealth's going to go away, that we'll learn later too, that like they only have wealth as long as Mr. Bennet is alive.
Right. And of course, Darcy doesn't have a title, so he's not in the nobility, but but he does have just a completely different status and set of privileges from what the Bennets have. And that is absolutely clear. But they're all landowners, right? So which is what gentleman meant then. It meant someone who owned land.
Well, that's the note we'll end on, this condemning of Darcy, and we'll see where that goes in the future. We had we might hit 400 people watching this show today.
Oh, that's fabulous! Oh, I can't wait to go read the chat and.
I know. I wish I could keep track of the chat. I couldn't keep track of the chat when we just did it on Zoom. There's no way I can keep track of it on YouTube. But Jay Knights. Thank you all for tuning in today. Remember, we have an Austen Mondays Facebook group where we can continue the conversation. Look us up on Facebook and join in that conversation. It's always very fun and very engaging. You can also go to the Rosenbach's YouTube account where you're watching it today. Go to the Rosenbach, like the Austen Mondays videos, subscribe to the channel. This really helps us. Leave comments there. This really helps us, gain greater visibility and generate more audience and more people watching from all over the world. I want to thank Brianna today from the Rosenbach. She was our chat Mrs. Reynolds in the managing the links in the chat. And the other shows we had for Jackie, it was a chat Renfield, Frankenstein was a chat Igor, Jane Eyre was the chat Mrs. Fairfax. And so this is the chat Mrs. Reynolds. You'll all learn who Mrs. Reynolds is later in the novel when we get to Derbyshire and Darcy's house. So thanks, Brianna. Next week on episode 2, we'll talk to Janine Barkas, author of The Lost Books of Jane Austen. And then we'll explore chapters 4 through 6, which I'm calling Ladies' Gossip and Darcy's Second Chance to Dance. And I'll do that with my co-host, Dr. Lauren Nixon. I can't wait to have Lauren back on the show. She's been on every show that we've done so far, so I'm really excited to have Lauren back. Everyone, if you're looking for more virtual engagement, head on over to the Rosenbach website. Check out the other virtual offerings we have, and the Rosenbach is also open to visit. You can see our website for how we make it safe for you to come and see our exhibitions and historic house in person, and lots of programs and courses coming up that you can sign up for, register for. And I ask you all to please support the Rosenbach, which you can do by donation. Or if you're not already a member, I invite you to join. Devoney, thank you so much.
Such a pleasure. Love riffing, love the drinking, love all the fun.
Good. I need to find another pipe smoker one day. Like pipe and drinking would be ideal, but I do love drinking with you and talking with you. Thank you so much.
Cheers.
I hope this is much fun for you as it was for me.
Such a pleasure.
And I hope you'll come back for another show in the second half of the series. You're absolutely invited. I'd love to see you come back again and talk about a later chapter.
Let's make that happen.
All righty. Thank you, everyone. Thanks to Tucker Christine, who wrote our opening and closing credits music. And thanks to my daughter, Lulu, who shot and created the credits with me. Farewell, readers. I will see you all again next week. Bye-bye.